Chinese archaeology is a field that has seen an enormous expansion in the last 3 decades or so at many different levels. First of all, the sheer number of excavation projects carried out in China, the publication of a true avalanche of books and articles that come out almost every day, certainly every month. At another level, there is a new sophistication in Chinese archaeology that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. And that, while there is still some continuity with the work of a previous generation of archaeologists, has made a leap forward towards a new plane of analytical depth and rigor. Professor von Falkenhausen has been one of the major figures in producing that leap, as his research tackles very large cultural and historical issues on which archaeological materials can provide the evidential basis for new interpretations and for the creation of new knowledge about ancient China. The questions that scholars are hoping archaeology will be able to answer are distributed over a very broad spectrum, territorially, chronologically, and theoretically. They require skills that are more complex, difficult to acquire, difficult to bring under a single person's control. Lothar von Falkenhausen is the person who more and better than any other I know, east or west, commands the linguistic, epigraphical, and paleographical, theoretical, anthropological, and historical knowledge of ancient China, supported by an immense knowledge of the material culture at the general level, at the local level as well. In Professor von Falkenhausen's vast production, one can find a meticulous description of Chinese silk found in Palmyra, next to a theoretical article on the historiographical orientation of Chinese archaeology. An essay on the religious and ritual meanings of funerary bronzes, next to an interpretive essay on the regionalist paradigm in Chinese archaeology. The constant triangulation between materiality, theory, and the critical rereading of given theoretical positions and established truths is what makes Lothar von Falkenhausen's scholarship especially engaging and always creative. His books are, in my view, first of all, efforts of discovery and recovery of meaning, reformulation of interpretive structures, where Professor von Falkenhausen brings to fruition not just a massive erudition, but also an especially penetrating critical sense. Together with the elegance of his language and the absorbing pace of his reasoning, I, for one, find his writings utterly fascinating. His early work was on the social and ritual significance of music in ancient China, with a path-breaking work on chime bells in the ritual and social context of the Zhou dynasty. The title is Suspended Music, Chime Bells in the Culture of Bronze Age China, published in 1993. This is a work that everyone has described as monumental, in which Professor von Falkenhausen makes a fundamental contribution not just to our understanding of Zhou ritual, but to early Chinese music and music theory, such as the interpretation of tone measurements. To describe properly this book, one would have to almost invent a field, archaeo-ethnomusicology, in the context of ancient China. The latest among a number of major works, Chinese Society in the Age of Confucius, 1000 to 250 BC, the Archaeological Evidence, published in 2006, makes the most fundamental claim in today's archaeology of ancient China, a claim already adumbrated in Professor von Falkenhausen's earlier contributions. And that is that archaeology creates new knowledge that is capable of transforming completely what we know of ancient China through the transmitted literary tradition. Also a monumental work, and apparently Professor von Falkenhausen cannot write anything that is not monumental, in his chronological sweep, but not constrained by a highly focused theme. This is the most rigorous analysis of pre-imperial Chinese society based on the enormous array of available archaeological evidence and constitutes a major step towards an integrated historical archaeological understanding of ancient China, in which archaeology takes, rightly, pride of place. Lest one may think that Professor von Falkenhausen is just a theorist or a so-called armchair archaeologist, I should say that this is not true, as he has been the principal investigator of the ongoing Peking University UCLA joint archaeological project, and is directing excavations of ancient salt production sites in the Yangtze River basin. I was lucky enough to have met and known Professor von Falkenhausen for many years, but also I knew his teacher, Professor Casey Chan, a true pioneer and leading light of Chinese archaeology in the United States. Before his terrible illness took him away, we had a few dinners together, in the course of which we talked about his students. And there was none of whom he spoke more highly than Professor von Falkenhausen. The twinkle in his eyes showed, more than the words he could no longer articulate very easily, that his whole career had been made more meaningful by having been succeeded by such a brilliant student and scholar. I think Lothar's achievements have exceeded the late Casey Chan's proudest expectations. Professor von Falkenhausen's lecture today is supported by the S.T. Lee Fund for Historical Studies and the Thyssen Foundation, and is entitled The First Emperor's Home Base, Archaeological Perspective on Ethnicity in Ancient China. Please join me in welcoming Professor
Thank you, Nicola, for the most flattering and at the same time embarrassing introduction I've ever had. I feel a little like Obama in that, you know, after the expectations that this has awakened, one cannot but disappoint. Nevertheless, I will proceed with this lecture, but I will tell you also that I feel like a distraction because I have really nothing to contribute to the subject of the symposium to which this lecture is supposed to be the introduction, namely the interface of archaeology and modern DNA-based research on genetics. This is something I'm very interested in, of course, as any archaeologist should be, but I have no idea about. And what I'm going to offer today are simply some considerations of a very general nature from an archaeologist who, as Nicola has already pointed out, is interested in cultural history. And if there are any anthropologists among you, you know that this is not an honorable thing to admit for a true anthropologist. But I can't help it, because if you do the Chinese Bronze Age, cultural history is something you cannot avoid. And in fact, in my opinion, it makes the whole endeavor worthwhile. Now, I will not begin with a definition of what I think ethnicity means. The complexities involved in this will become clear soon enough. But I shall take you directly to a map of the Qin Empire. As you all probably know, the first emperor of Qin unified the key areas of continental East Asia for the first time under a centralized imperial regime in 221 BC. And even though this Qin Empire lasted only for a dozen years or so, it established a foundation for a political system that endured with changes, but nevertheless for about 2,000 years. Qin, by the way, is most probably the origin of our word China. So the Qin empire is the beginning of China in a traditional sense. Qin was famously surrounded by a wall, well, at least on the northern edge. This wall, and here are three images of it that you can download from the internet. These aren't ones that I took myself, but it still is preserved in many areas. Some of them actually not presently part of the territory of the People's Republic of China. It does extend all the way north to parts of Outer Mongolia, the Mongolian Republic. This is not like the Ming Great Wall that everybody goes to see when they visit Beijing, and which was constructed in the 16th century, 15th century AD as a defense against the Mongols. This Qin Great Wall is not a defensive installation, but it was an attempt to place as much territory as feasible under the control of the empire, and to make sure that everybody enclosed within was going to be subject to the administrative regime, and very crucially, of course, the taxation that the very efficient administrative apparatus of the Qin Empire was able to exert. At a more symbolic level, moreover, the Qin Great Wall defined the sphere of what the inhabitants of the Qin Empire were manipulated into believing was the sphere of civilization, and it also excluded, of course, the non-participants in civilization to the wastelands beyond. Now, of course, Nicola Di Cosmo in this room and many other scholars have perhaps done a great deal to upset these kinds of stereotypes, but this is perhaps at least what was intended. And no matter whether you consider this historical reality or not, the Qin Great Wall was certainly crucial in establishing a sense of contrast between inside and outside, between the agricultural Chinese civilization, all of this can be put in quotation marks, and the nomadic steppe lands beyond. It also had the effect of eliminating intermediary cultural formations that had sort of mediated the contrast between the fully agricultural heartland of Chinese civilization and the steppes, and which had existed in this area since at least Neolithic times. The imposition of Qin administration certainly had the effect of exacerbating sort of a binary contrast between these two areas. So even though it was a military installation and political in its intentions and effect, the wall was certainly conducive to the formation of a sense of Chinese ethnicity, and one could mention as one element in this something that is obvious, namely the joint experience of hundreds of thousands of convict laborers from all parts of the empire in constructing this wall would have perhaps contributed to creating a supra-regional sense of community within the population in the empire. So, in a sense, these public projects of Qin may have contributed, or very probably contributed, to the formation of a sense of Chinese ethnicity. And of course it is still, albeit under very different auspices, used to this end by the contemporary Chinese regime. Not necessarily the Qin Great Wall, by the way, but the Great Wall as a general concept. note that I would like to use the word ethnicity in this in a very loose sense, because today certainly the kind of identity the wall is used to create is a national identity in a polity that self-consciously acknowledges itself to be a multi-ethnic state. And multi-ethnicity is part of the usual anthropological definitions of what an empire is. The Qin Empire is no exception. It was most likely conceived by its ruling class as a self-consciously multi-ethnic entity. Somebody up there objects. The sense of unity that was created in wall building and other public progresses may not at least have been intended to be a narrowly ethnic one. How ethnic identities within the Qin Empire were configured is a really complex issue to which there are different approaches, and I naturally address this through the archaeological record. For instance, many scholars today, many archaeologists today, believe that the populations of the various kingdoms that had existed in continental East Asia before the Qin unification constituted, which you see on the map here, constituted something like ethnic groups within the new empire, the new Qin Empire. In particular, such a claim is often made with respect to the peripheral kingdoms, such as Chu in the south and Qin in the west. Due to the unification, so these archaeologists, who at this point perhaps constitute a mainstream in contemporary Chinese archaeologists, would argue these ethnic distinctions within the empire were gradually obliterated as the overarching sense of Chinese identity strengthened as the empire developed. And even today, of course, the name, the autonym, the self-designation of the Chinese ethnic group takes its name from the more long-lived dynasty that succeeded the Qin, the Han dynasty. So this is an influential train of thought in Chinese archaeology today. It goes back, among others, to Su Bingqi, who has defined the glorious task of patriotic archaeology as tracing the formation of the Chinese nation from these, what he calls Qu-Xi-Lei-Xing, the regional systems that co-evolved in time. And this has, in fact, defined the archaeological mainstream within China since the 1980s and has resulted in a great deal of very valuable and exciting archaeological work, even though the theoretical underpinnings are not unproblematic. Conveniently, one reason for why this is not unproblematic is that conveniently many of the regional systems as defined by contemporary archaeologists happen to coincide with the boundaries of present-day provinces. And anybody of you familiar with modern theories of nation building and nationalism knows what that means. Of course, this is a projection onto antiquity of contemporary administrative experience, which has a historical memory constructed for it. When we read about various local cultures in the archaeological literature today, we very frequently really read about a subtext of inter-province jockeying for prestige within the modern Chinese nation. I've written about this in an article mentioned by Nicola earlier, and in fact, my theory has actually been verified by historical experience. 2 years after I published this article, Chongqing municipality split off from Sichuan province, and lo and behold, suddenly what was originally called the Bashu culture in Sichuan was divorced into two: the Shu culture of Sichuan and the Ba culture of Chongqing. And the archaeological evidence didn't change. Something else had obviously changed. Anyway, one other a region of many that I would like to bring up in questioning whether necessarily all these polities that you see the names of on the screen right now correspond to early ethnic groups, is that when you look at the archaeological remains from a broad perspective, the level of difference between them is quite different from case to case. For instance, the level of difference between those polities constituting the core of the formerly Royal Zhou civilization along the river, the Yellow River, are not very distinct from one another, whereas formerly independent areas such as the already mentioned Ba and Shu in the southwest really stand out as vastly contrasting from both them and also other local kingdoms. So conceptualizing all of these as manifestations of one and the same level of distinction is highly problematic, and I have tried to resist this. This also, of course, then translates into a very fundamental problem of archaeological classification and a methodological issue that it would lead too far to try to illustrate in detail right now. But I do want to bring this up as one problem. So, rather than pontificating about generality, I would now like to look at Qin and at how archaeologists have tried to define a Qin ethnicity in its archaeological remains. And of course, Qin existed as a polity from for more than half a millennium. So there is a great deal of material from different time periods that we can look at in such an attempt. Qin originated during the early first millennium BC in the far northwest of what was then the realm of the Zhou dynasty, which had its historical centers in present-day Shanxi province and Henan province along the center, in the center of this map. And which from 771 BC onwards, during the Eastern Zhou period, was virtually limited to this very small area in present-day Henan, around the Luoyang capital. Qin, by contrast, was on the ascendant during this period. It was a relative newcomer to the multi-state system of the Zhou, which was in which the royal center was surrounded by any number of local polities. Only the most potent ones of which are mentioned on this map. And but Qin was relatively late in having been founded as a polity, only at the end of the 9th century. Now, within a generation of its founding, a group of invaders from the north, referred to in the historical texts as the Dog Barbarians, or Quanrong, invaded the original Zhou heartland in this area of Shanxi and drove out the Zhou. Subsequently, the area was taken over by Qin and became the core of its fast evolving kingdom, which in the course of some 500 years gradually gobbled up all the other contenders to power, and the rest, of course, is history, namely the Qin Empire. Now, traditional historiography relates that the Qin drove out the dog barbarians, and were rewarded for this by the king, by the Zhou king, with the former royal capital area, which they then made into their capital. But there's also a competing theory that has sort of been asserted off and on by heterodox historians, and which was brought in the limelight as a more critical strain of historiography took form in the 20th century, namely that the Qin themselves were none other than the dog barbarians, who were somehow, at least, or part of them perhaps, were accommodated into the territorial structure of the Zhou kingdom, and became one of the Zhou numeral vassal polities, like many others. This is, of course, not an issue that archaeology can ultimately resolve. This is a historical issue, but archaeological materials have certainly been used by a number of archaeologists to at least illustrate the issues involved, and it is interesting to have a look at this for a little while. But before I do so, let me show you a few slides of the region in which Qin prospered when we can first grasp it archaeologically. And that is the upper Wei River Valley in what is now eastern Gansu province. In the upper Wei River Valley, and also the upper reaches of the Xihan River, which you see here, eastern Gansu province, which has historically been inhabited, even in relatively recent times, by a multiplicity of ethnic groups. Historical sources record three main groups of these. Namely, during the first millennium BC, there may have been others who are not as well known, but the three main groups we can name are the Qiang or Jiang, or to the west, who may possibly have been ancestral to Tangut or Tibetan-speaking groups in a very wide sense. Then, secondly, the northern neighbors in the steppes, of whom we really cannot responsibly say what kinds of language they spoke, but Gustav Halaun in the 1920s hypothesized that they might have, or some of them might have been Indo-European speakers, and perhaps some of them spoke languages related to Turkic. That's an idea that also was advanced numerous times in the 20th century, Turkic or Turco-Mongolian. Perhaps Nicola has an opinion about this. In any case, they were also there, living in the steppes to the north. And then, of course, there was a third group of inhabitants in this area whose material culture resembles that of the inhabitants of the core area of China. There is a first sense of such similarities about 2000 BC in the Qijia culture, but I don't want to get into that. That's a late Neolithic, early Bronze Age culture, which has interesting similarities to areas further to the east. But there's also, after about 1000 BC, a presence here of material culture that resembles that of the Chinese heartland, that at that point was part of the Zhou kingdom. Before we look at these archaeological remains, let us look for a moment at the local natural environment. We have an environment of less hills, about 800 to 1,500 meters above sea level, a very fertile soil, but semi-arid climate, still enough rainfall to allow agriculture without artificial irrigation on the valley bottoms. Nowadays, of course, everything is irrigated, but not during the times we are talking about today. And it is also, of course, a geographical pivot, one of the geographical pivots of China. The Wei River being linked, a tributary to the Yellow River and linked to the core area further to the east, and also to Central Asia by way of the Gansu corridor. And then the Xihan River to the south, within a very short the distance, easily to traverse watershed, is the upper reaches of the Yangtze in the south, and links this area to the much more humid and moist and warm climes of Sichuan to the in southwest China. And the archaeological work in this area has gradually revealed cultural connections since very ancient times, connecting these areas to all parts of Asia. So in terms of Zhou, the Zhou center, this is a periphery, but in terms of itself, it may not necessarily have conceived itself as such. Recent archaeological research has revealed an early Qin urban center at the locality known as Xishan in Lixian County in Gansu, on the Xihan River, sort of on the southwestern periphery of the core area of early Qin, which was likely set up very early on in the history of the Qin polity, and which flourished throughout the history of Qin. It may have been Qin's earliest capital, or anyway, seat of the ruling lineage. And as Qin's political centers moved to the east, starting in the 8th and 7th centuries, this was still maintained as a local center. It was the western outpost of Qin control, and numerous archaeological remains. These are typical Qin ceramics, household ceramics, as well as funerary ceramics from various parts of the first millennium BC, show that it flourished. There's also a ritual center on this mountain overlooking this earliest capital of Qin, which was maintained also throughout later periods, and in fact even still continuing during the Han Dynasty as the center for the veneration of the god of the West in Qin's cosmological religion, which had one deity for each of the four directions. And the memory of Qin and its early rulers was perpetuated in this region even during the Han Dynasty. This vessel, the Qin Gonggui, cast in the 6th century BC, was found here in the 1920s, and it bears an inscription commemorating the 12 earliest rulers of Qin, but it also has an inscription that was scratched on later during the Han Dynasty, showing that it was still in use in some local sanctuary during that time. So this is the area that was, we are beginning to realize, and these are fairly recent excavations, just from the last 5 years, that was the earliest center of the Qin ruling groups. The earliest tombs of Qin rulers have also been found very nearby here at a locality called Dabuzishan. They were all hideously looted with the active support of the local police in the 1990s. But the empty tomb pits have been excavated by archaeologists, and fortunately some sacrificial pits nearby have recently been excavated and still were found filled with important archaeological materials. Some of these are very large tombs with 2 ramps leading into them. I'll get back to what this might mean later on. These recent excavations have yielded a set of bells that have actually that are inscribed by the Patriarch of Qin, the ruler of Qin in its time. We don't know which of the several possible candidates he was, but these are clearly Qin rulers' tombs. Not only historical geography, but actually original inscriptions prove this. So why it is clear that it is clear so that a polity in the Zhou mold, a regional polity that was part of the Zhou kingdom, existed in this area of eastern Gansu as of the 8th century BC and into the 6th century and later. What was its economic basis? Well, very briefly, agriculture, which is, of course, still practiced today, and sometimes with techniques that may not be so what have I done now? So distinct from what was done in the Qin, under the Qin regime. Then the historical sources mention that the rulers of Qin raised horses in this part of China for the Zhou king. I find this slightly dubious because the terrain is not really horse-grazing countries, and I rather suspect that instead the Qin were some kind of a funnel for horses that were raised by their neighbors in the steppes and which they then transported to the Zhou kingdom. But this is up to discussion. And thirdly, and I think the main reason why the capital was established in the precise location that it was, is the presence of natural resources in this area, in particular gold and salt. This is a still functioning salt well in a little village in Liqian County. And gold has been found, is still being mined there today, or one should perhaps say mined again after some hiatus today. So who were the people represented by these finds? Who were the early inhabitants of Qin? Traditional historiography identifies them as members of the Ying clan, who had allegedly immigrated from somewhere east during the early Zhou period, several generations, about a dozen generations, before the foundation of the Qin polity, which I've already told you happened about 800 BC. And the historical texts even mention a lineage of pre-dynastic Qin rulers. Archaeologists have claimed to have found the traces of these early immigrants at village sites in the Upper Wei River Valley, starting that go back to a period starting, in fact, several centuries before the founding of the Qin polity. And the most well-known site at which such finds have been made is Maojiaping in Gangu County. And this is what the area looks like today. And these are some of the remains that have been found there. Essentially, settlements remains and a number of tombs. These are the earliest Zhou-like remains in the Gansu region. They are, interestingly, quite homogeneous in the early period. You can see the ceramic complex here. That's from the time corresponding to the Western Zhou period. But in the later phase of occupation at Maojiaping, there are two very highly distinct ceramic complexes represented among the remains, complexes A and B, as the archaeologists have called them, and you can see them here in the chart. And we will have more slides in a moment. Complex A, and each of these complexes can be traced to origins in very different parts of continental East Asia. Complex A is essentially this is what it looks like, is essentially a local variant of Western Zhou, Orthodox Western Zhou household ceramics. The most distinctive of these is always the pouch-shaped tripod known as li, which you see here and here. These are the sort of the main focus of attention of ceramic analysis in Chinese archaeology. These particular li vessels are the representatives of a type of li that was invented in Shanxi during the early phase of the Zhou kingdom there, and which involved cutting up part of a cylinder of clay like this, and then folding up the sides so as to form the three legs. Most li vessels found elsewhere in China, including those of complex B at Maojiaping, were not made in this way. They were made by making three separate legs and then kneading the legs together at the crotch, which is perhaps the more original, the more primitive way of making them. But in the Zhou realm, after about 1100 BC, this type of li was commonly used, and I'm showing you just a few examples from all different parts of the Zhou culture sphere. These are from the Zhou heartland. These are from further to the east and north in Shanxi province, and these are some Qin examples from later periods, later than the Maojiaping finds that I'm showing you now. So the complex A is unproblematically part of what we call the material culture of the Zhou kingdom. Complex B, on the other hand, looks very different. As I mentioned, the pouch-shaped feet of the li vessels are separately made and then put together, and also the other types used are all different. These little handles on the side are typical, and various other features. And these essentially assimilate the complex B to a regional culture in the Gansu area known as the Siwa culture, which is quite heterogeneous, but here are assemblages of pottery vessels from a number of different Siwa sites, and you can see this and this, for instance, are li vessels that look quite similar to what we found at Maojiaping. Now, interestingly, the Siwa sites, Siwa culture sites, and the early Qin sites or Zhou-type sites in the Upper Wei River Valley and adjacent areas are essentially dating to the same period, but they tend to be found in different physical environments. If you look at the map and see where the dots are, the Zhou-type sites tend to be along riverbanks, whereas the Siwa type sites are further afield, either in areas that are farther away, or in fact in more mountainous areas. And this indicates, no doubt, a difference in lifestyle as well as a difference in ceramic making. The Siwa people, even though they were settled, were probably herders and only partly agricultural, whereas the Zhou-type settlements were manifestations of rather typical agricultural civilization of Orthodox Chinese type. Now, we now may wonder why we may wonder what this dichotomy at Maojiaping actually signifies. Do we have, in fact, two completely different groups of different origin? Immigrants versus the indigenous population of this eastern Gansu area? Or do we simply have different segments of the same group, namely the fully agricultural ones versus the herders, of which perhaps the fully agricultural members have taken up the more efficient agricultural techniques of their neighbors to the east. The archaeological evidence we have cannot resolve this issue, but if we had DNA evidence, that possibly might tell us something, but perhaps not. There might also be, a combination of the two factors. Some immigrants mixing with local people and changing part of the local cultural scenes, starting in about 1000 BC, and sort of coexisting, even though that still wouldn't explain completely why the early phases at Maojiaping seem to be purely of the Zhou style. They are silviculture sites from the same period, but they are not at Maojiaping. They are in the surrounding areas, whereas in the later phase, the two cultural elements coexist. This is a true enigma. I don't know what this means. But there are additional cultural elements of complexity that suggest that at least the possible immigrant populations, the ones who practiced Zhou ways, were not completely like the other inhabitants of the Zhou culture sphere. And this has to do with burial customs. These are and in fact, this is a feature common to both the Group A and Group B remains at Maojiaping. They have tombs and also the Siwa area, culture area surrounding it. They tend to have tombs with flexed burial and tombs where the head of the deceased is oriented east-west. This is common to A and B, whereas everywhere else in the Zhou culture sphere, we have tombs that look like this, which are oriented north-south with the deceased person in the stretched position, not flexed as we had before. These are just two out of literally hundreds of thousands of known examples going back to the Neolithic. This is an old tradition which whoever these inhabitants at Maojiaping were, and this includes Group A and Group B, chose not to follow, and which do have, as David here knows very well, parallels further afield in Central Asia, both of these. So what does this mean? What do we decide is more essential in defining ethnic characteristics, the burial culture or the ceramics? What do we, allow us to decide, whether these people are full participants in Zhou culture or not? And does it even matter? Did it matter to them at the time? At what level did it matter? I, of course, think that these burial customs mainly reflect religious beliefs that may not be bound to ethnicity at all. But this is only a hypothesis. Archaeology can only show what happened. What happened? Well, when the Qin invaded or occupied the former capital area of the Zhou kingdom, the tombs at local cemeteries suddenly and universally shifted an orientation from north to south. You can see this on this plan. And the mode of burial shifted from straight to flexed. Now, does this mean that there was a replacement of population of the Zhou capital area by newcomers from Qin? Or did the new Qin regime impose, for some ideological or religious or political reason, the new burial modes, such as like the Manchus imposed the pigtail on all Chinese males, Han Chinese males? We don't know, and we cannot know through archaeology. We might be able to find out certain aspects of the story through DNA analysis, but even there one would probably have to be very careful, because no matter what happened, there was probably intermarriage between different groups, and so the data would have to be interpreted in a very nuanced way. So we can tell that. We can tell archaeologically whether a tomb is a Qin tomb or not by the orientation and mode of burial. But of course, then this mode of burial did spread beyond the confines of Qin, which gives rise to my hypothesis that this really reflects some kind of religious belief that somehow was, for some reason, was adopted by the Qin, by important people in Qin before it spread to other areas. Now, as Qin expanded, one more feature that is important, namely the so-called waste pit or yaokeng, which is a little pit at the bottom of a tomb, like here or here, containing a sacrificed animal, usually a dog, but not always. This is another religious custom which is normally associated with the Shang, the royal dynasty that came before the Zhou, and which inconveniently for this story ruled over a part of continental East Asia that was quite unconnected to eastern Gansu, but was much further to the east. Now there are early legends that link the Ying clan and the ruling house of Qin to the Shang royal house. And of course, archaeologists have latched to the discovery of yaokeng or waste pits in Qin tombs. Not very many, but some, and some very important Qin tombs, as a reason to believe these legends about Shang origin. I am reluctant to accept this, and once again, I would much rather see this as the reflection of a religious custom rather than of genetic descent from people who had lived so far away. But it cannot be completely excluded. What is clear is that waste pits or yaokeng, here's an example from eastern China dating to the Eastern Zhou period, so this did continue in formerly Shang areas, even in the period contemporary to these tombs. And what is interesting is that these waste pits are seen even in rulers' tombs, such as the ones at Dabuzishan. So, this much about the earliest phase, about various levels of complexity in trying to identify who the earliest participants in what archaeologists call Qin culture, and I put this into quotation marks, were. Were they immigrants? Were they a mixture? Were they natives who somehow got acculturated? The jury is still out there. Let me look now with you at a few pieces of evidence from slightly later times that archaeologists use to identify the material signature of Qin culture as it developed into a major kingdom. There are several key features. One is the gigantomania of Qin rulers' tombs. This starts as early as the Dabuzishan tombs, which are bigger than any others, including the royal tombs of the Zhou, which have been found recently, and which are a fraction of the size of these, from the same period, and which constantly taken to a greater extreme. Here is a 6th century BC example, the tomb, possibly the tomb of Patriarch Qin at the necropolis of Qin, near its capital of Yong, which they occupied between the 7th and the early 4th centuries BC. This is 8 stories deep. You could put this building from the basement all the way to the ceiling in there twice. Enormous, and of course filled with the sarcophagi of human sacrifices. So a very lavish remains that has probably no equal among the mortuary remains of of pre-imperial China anywhere else. And it goes on. Here's another example: the tomb of a member of the royal family of Qin during its last century of its existence. Some people have thought that this is possibly the tomb of the first emperor's grandmother. In any case, it is a very large cruciform tomb with 4 ramps, which indicates, very much according to the orthodoxy, that this is a royal tomb. They had by then usurped the royal title. When you have only 2 ramps, as in the examples I showed you so far, you define yourself as one notch below the level of the kings. At this point, they no longer recognized the overlordship of the Zhou kings, and they were about to take over. This is also where the picture and the announcement comes from. Don't be fooled by the size of the slide. It's only 2 centimeters high, and I will have more to say about it in a moment. And of course, the first emperor's tomb as well stands as only the last and most extravagant example of a long tradition of outlandishly large tomb construction. This is arguably one peculiarity of Qin that we can define archaeologically. Now, is this an ethnic characteristic? Another characteristic we have is the use of gold in some of these tombs. Gold was not a metal or material subject to the usual sumptuary rules, so it could be used to simply enhance the dazzling effect of everything, and that was certainly why it was included in the tombs, besides the fact that, as I already mentioned, it was a local material that was available in the Qin core area. Normally, of course, the ruling elite of the Zhou states used these ritual bronzes, sets of them, inscribed with the names and the meritorious events of their owners. And some of these have also been recovered after the Dabu Zeshans were looted. These are only part of what must have been, in its time, a very extravagant assemblage. And of course, there are also non-ritual bronzes that were used, such as this one now in the Shanghai Museum, which may have come from Dabu Zeshan as well, and all these little birds and fish can be moved around, and it's really a plaything. Probably they moved on swivels when they poured water inside. It's very nice, but this is not a ritual vessel. It is, however, a genuine vessel, and probably was brought to Qin by a Qin bride, who of course came from outside. And then, of course, the recent excavations have yielded materials that are very close to my early interests in Chinese music, namely musical bells. And these are very similar to another set of musical bells found in the 1970s, which have a long inscription. And this inscription explicitly makes it explicit that the rulers of Qin in this period intended to be considered as the equals, if not the superiors, of the Zhou kings. and they usurp the ritual language that conventionally is reserved to the kings. So we have the self-representation of Qin as a giganticized version of a Zhou-type polity, which is all set to take over the kingdom. And of course, on one level, they exceeded all the limitations. On the other hand, at the same time, they adhered more strictly than anybody else to the ritual systems. I've already shown this in the connection with the number of ramps in the rulers' tombs, where at least as long as they still acknowledged the kings, they kept themselves to the number of 2, even though the tombs themselves were far bigger. Similarly, the bronzes that were made in Qin are stylistically much more conservative than those made in other parts of China at the time. And they use, in the inscriptions, use formulae that hark back to the flourishing period of the Zhou kingdom before it was expelled by the so-called Dog barbarians. So some people have tried to explain this by the fact, which is undoubtedly true as far as it goes, that the Qin, when they took over the Zhou capital, also took over the royal bronze-making workshops that were located there. But there's more to it. There's also an intention to be like the Zhou kingdom, and we see this orthodoxy at the lower level as well, where the bronze vessels that are found are stylistically archaic compared to their equivalents in other parts of the Zhou culture sphere. I can't get into the details right now, but we see an astounding continuity in shapes all the way through the time of Shangyang's reform in the 4th century, which abolished the hereditary aristocracy and completely changed the system. But until then, even though the bronzes became ever smaller and were transformed into miniature, and even though in many cases they were actually replaced by imitations made out of pottery, up until this time, they really adhere very closely to a canon of shapes that goes back to the early Zhou period. So, what does this mean? Is that this is certainly the political self-representation, the political and religious, but these two things go together in early China, self-representation of the Qin state. No matter who they really were, what matters is how they behaved, I would argue, and they certainly behaved like members of Zhou culture, maybe even more orthodox members of Zhou culture than many of the others. Of course, the adoption of identity, of the performance of of Zhou identity was enhanced by the identification of the ruling group with the Ying clan, which made it possible for them to intermarry with the ruling families of other kingdoms or states in the Zhou kingdom, including with the royal Zhou family themselves. Some bronze inscriptions show this, and this brought these originally peripheral inhabitants very close to the center. Now, I am not convinced that any of these things that I've just pointed out about the nature of Qin as a polity helps us to resolve the issue of ethnicity. Whether the population of the enlarged kingdom, for instance, was filled with people whose ancestors had come from eastern Gansu, or whether they had amalgamated with originally local population, is not clear. What we do know is that after Shangyang's reform, numerous immigrants were brought in from areas to the east to provide labor and manpower in the nation building of the Qin, the nascent Qin Empire. But that's a different story. In theory, in any case, the performance of Zhou identity is independent of ethnic affiliation, and it could be interpreted, of course, and it has been, in fact, as showing that we Chinese are tremendously open to whoever comes in as long as they behave correctly, which is, of course, a kind of discourse you still see in modern China. And perhaps, in fact, something of this nature went on in pre-imperial times, but whether it was even conceptualized at the time in ethnic terms in this way is something archaeology cannot easily show. Let us finally return to the engagement by members of the Qin elite with non-Qin groups. And I will just briefly show some finds that show this. These are in fact not all from the Qin area, but from North China in general, where we find these types of vessels, sometimes in tombs. And these are buckets used to boil meat. Normally, these are seen in nomadic contexts, and they look like this, and they come up in Xinjiang and in Kazakhstan and all the way to Hungary, in fact. Whereas in China, they were only used. They are only seen sometimes as an extraneous complement to orthodox vessel assemblages in tombs. But it seems that they were made in some quantities at Chinese bronze manufacturing workshops for the nomadic market. The same thing, or a similar phenomenon, seems to have existed when it comes to the nomadic fashion of the Warring States period, when people started wearing riders' gear with these very fashionable belt hooks, which soon became the focus of a great deal of artistic elaboration, but which were made also in great quantities by Chinese workshops for the nomadic market, and which were made in China in nomadic styles. This has been shown by close technical analysis. So finding an object and being able to trace the circulation of objects of different types, which is of course something we archaeologists do, does not necessarily tell us either the ethnic affiliation of who made it, or for that matter the ethnic affiliation of the people with whom it is seen. Because even though the nomadic fashions probably originated in the northern steppes, they were embraced by the inhabitants of the Zhou sphere without, needless to say, the inhabitants of the Zhou sphere in that sense taking on a nomadic ethnic identity. But there is one example, only one, that I'm aware of, where I think I can pinpoint to an archaeological context in Qin of a tomb containing a non-Qin person, a person who is performing a nomadic ethnic identity. And this is tomb number 2 at Imenzun in Baoji, smack in the suburban area of the Qin capital of the time. It dates to about 500 BC. This is clearly an elite tomb of a very rich person, filled to the brim with precious objects made out of semi-precious stones, and some of the earliest iron knives have been found, or daggers have been found there, which at this point were still luxury items with gold grips and all kinds of other wonderful things, filled to the brim, but lacking any of the ancestral, the sacrificial bronzes that are normally the marker of any self-respecting member of the Chinese or the Zhou elite. This includes the Qin elite. Here we have none of this, only the kinds of luxury objects you would associate with a member of the nomadic fringe, except that every single item in the tomb is made in Qin. You can tell this by the style. So, even so, I think the person in there is clearly not a member of the Qin elite, but somebody else, and archaeologists have speculated that he might have been a hostage taken from a nomadic population in the vicinity. There are all kinds of possibilities. We don't really know. But it is clear that such a person living in Qin was able to acquire in Qin the trappings of that enabled him to behave as he or she, we don't really know, considered appropriate to her or his ethnic identity. Here I come back to this tiny piece of gold which was found in the unfortunately very badly looted large tomb at Shenreyuan, which, as I already mentioned, may have belonged to one of the immediate ancestors of the first emperor. This tiny object escaped the looters, and it shows, as you can see, a goat with very curious sort of cutouts on its body, and the hind legs sort of thrown up into the air in a way that is anatomically patently impossible, but which is very typical for nomadic styles in Siberia. We find them tattooed on the arms of the the occupant of tomb number 2 at Pazirik, and also in the felt items from there, and here you also see these cutouts which you have here on the body. This is very clearly where this comes from. Now, is this an imported object? Is this piece of gold an imported object from the steppe? I doubt it. It is probably made in Qin, but by somebody who enjoyed aesthetically these types of objects and who saw nothing wrong with this. Nomadic taste is something, the taste for the exotic is something that we have to take into account as archaeologists when trying to evaluate whether or not archaeological finds of a certain appearance indicate ethnic identity. In this case, undoubtedly they don't, but that is only one of many possible examples. Also relevant in this context, and I do come to the end now, are the very recent and very exciting finds at the site of Madhyayuan in the Muslim autonomous county of Zhangjiachuan in eastern Gansu, not far from the early Qin sites that I showed you, but dating to the 3rd century BC, the end of the Warring States period, where we find, very interestingly, tombs and pits filled with these extraordinary chariots, chariots that look at these pits, and the chariots themselves are of types that we are also quite used to seeing in the Zhou culture sphere, but the ornamentation is quite different. It is certainly in a local style that has some affinities to the animal-derived ornamentation modes that we associated with steppe art. Note again that this doesn't mean that that this came from the steppe. To the contrary, they were quite possibly made in Qin for people of alien ethnic identity. And here it seems, or local archaeologists have identified these tombs with a group of non-Qin people of a marginal identity, sort of in between the orthodox adherents to Zhou civilization and the steppe nomads out there. They were obviously not horse-riding nomads, they were chariot drivers, but the art style is too weird to accept that these people could have been themselves members of the Qin elite, and they are also too far, they are located too far away from the centers to make this credible. So here are some of these motifs that seem to show steppe affiliation. On the other hand, the tombs at Matyayuan also yielded quite typical late Warring States period vessels of Qin types, some of them even inscribed. So at some level, these local populations were clearly tied into the Qin political and cultural sphere. What have we learned? Well, perhaps not much, except that it seems likely that the Qin polity, from its very beginnings, was an ethnically rather complex entity and continued to be so, albeit in different articulations, all the way to the end. And ultimately, that what matters historically is, and now I'm going to be very brutal and perhaps wrong, is not somebody's DNA, but how they behave and whether or not they are able to convincingly embody the political and religious and social and economic ideals that are current in their societies. But we will hopefully discuss this further in the coming proceedings. Thank you.
Fascinating and a brilliant talk. Thank you, Lothar. We still have a few minutes, if you don't mind to entertain a few questions. It's always a tricky operation when one tries to sort of unmelt a melting pot of ethnicity. Please.
If Qin indeed has this strong connection with nomadic people, and is it curious that Qin actually tried to build this wall and restrict themselves, restrict their ambition, try to preserve the nomadic population outside this wall?
Yeah.
Any theory about this?
Well, what this presumably shows is that the Qin state decided that the way to become a powerful empire was to adopt the political ways of the Zhou and to establish an agricultural regime taxing the peasantry, and to shut out from this system the nomadic populations as far as and put them as far away as possible, because they are more difficult to control. That's the short answer. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the Qin had a great deal of relations. I mean, were necessarily descended from nomadic populations, but it is not impossible that they were, and they simply changed. Yes.
So you didn't say anything about the terracotta army. Can you make any conjectures about the ethnicity from which you look at?
Well, the reason why I brought this up at the end is that frequently the people who comment on this point out how different the nuances of facial expressions are on this, and it has certainly been brought up the possibility that these might indicate different sort of social or ethnic groups within the Qin Empire. Now, we all know that these were made in molds, okay, and mass-produced from a limited number. I think there are 36 types altogether, and then they were sort of finished individually and made slightly different, but they aren't necessarily sort of meant to be character types or national heads in this sense. But of course, the effect of bringing together an army, and this is something that has been mentioned in nationalism discourse in modern Western history a great deal, is that it tends to bring together the different parts of a country. And so in that sense, the Terracotta Army presumably does represent a new Qin identity, whether ethnic or multi-ethnic in its own self-definition. We really don't know anymore, although legal documents from the decade or so before the Qin unification actually do show that, for instance, the inhabitants of the conquered areas in the south had a different legal status from the inhabitants of the Qin core. This may have ended with the unification, but we don't really know that yet. So ethnic differentiations may have been drawn, but once you became a member of this kind of an outfit, probably they became rather unimportant. And other things become important. And the definition of your identity, of course, is taken to a different level. The counterpart is no longer perhaps the inhabitant of some other area within the Qin Empire, but those nomadic threats elsewhere. Yes. David first, and then over there.
You mentioned the waste pits that frequently contain dog sacrifices.
Yes.
Is there any possible connection between that ritual practice and the designation dog barbarian?
Would be a very interesting question, because in that case the Shang, who were the epitome of a Chinese civilization before the Zhou came along, would also have been dog barbarians. There are certainly no texts that say that. So I think the normal, the explanation that is sometimes given for dog barbarians is that their language was ununderstandable and sounded like the barking of dogs, but who knows? Yes.
You talked about inscriptions, and I would like to ask whether can one make a connection between language and material culture and ethnicity, or
Yes. Yes.
we don't know anything about that.
That's one of the great themes in archaeology, of course. And as a matter of methodological principle, it cannot be done, but it is nevertheless often done, and it is very plausible in many cases. In fact, if you want to read a really plausible possible example, you only need to read the book by David Anthony here present, who goes as far as one can in making this point, even though, strictly speaking, it cannot be. These are two different realms, and no amount of analysis, even DNA analysis, is going to tell you what language somebody spoke. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
You have a vessel from Urumqi in one of your screens there, and I can't picture with the mummies in Urumqi have been on the outside or the inside of that wall that you were talking about.
Very much on the outside and dating about 1,500 years before. Yeah. But the mummies of Urumqi is of course a misleading title because they are not from Urumqi. They are only in the museum there. They come from an area quite a long distance away from there.
That's why I was asking if they had come all the way into the Qin area, but no.
No, certainly not. At least, well, as far as we know. In fact, I mentioned again, if you read David Anthony's wonderful book, you will find a rather compelling idea that the population to which these mummies belong are the early representative of Tocharian-speaking groups who are Indo-European speaking, and there is a slight possibility that Tocharian-speaking groups were present until the end of the Bronze Age in the immediate vicinity of Qin. In fact, the Madhya Yuan chariots might have belonged to people like that, who were driven out of this area by the Xiongnu in about 250 BC. But this is, again, this is something that of which we have tantalizing historical evidence and now a little bit of archaeological evidence that inspires our fantasy, but ultimately archaeology cannot show. Ben Ehrman, yes. Oh, yes, over there. Hmm. Well, the Han is, of course, a very different kettle of fish because it doesn't go back to any of the local ruling houses of the pre-imperial period, so we can't really trace the elite group during pre-Han periods, archaeologically or in any other way. They were upstarts. Furthermore, during the Han period, you have the Xiongnu Empire to the north, and so you have this dichotomy, the sense of a north-south dichotomy, which certainly for the vast majority of the stretch of time that I've been talking about was not yet, I mean, it was germinating, but it wasn't quite as pronounced. So that would view these things in a very different light. What one would focus on in the Han case probably would be the extent to which at the beginning of the Western Han you still have rather distinct local phenomena in different regions, some of them going back to pre-imperial, pre-Qin traditions, some of them not, and how those change and become largely more similar over time, although of course regionalism reasserts itself in different guises, and then the challenge becomes, which of this regionalism that you can see is actually a continuation of an earlier tradition or a new regionalism that is germinating in the time in which you see it. So, and Han dynasty, Han specialists deal with such issues. One would need probably more than just one more lecture to discuss a representative sample of examples.
This one, we perhaps have
Yes.
one last question.
Sami, yes.
What do you think about the significance of historical text or historical records on helping us to understand the ethnicity of the Qin? Because if we do not rely on it, but for archaeology, for drawing the territory, we still rely on the historical text to tell where the Qin boundary is.
Yes. Yes. Well, there are two answers to this. First of all, fortunately, we have some inscriptions on archaeologically provenienced objects which allow us to make secure connections between the archaeological evidence and at least the gist of the historical records. That, of course, doesn't prove that the historical records are true in every detail, but it does give certain general indications. Secondly, in my analysis today and also generally in my work, I'm trying to get away from the excessive focus on written materials, which has been characteristic of Chinese archaeological practice for perfectly fine historical reasons. You know this very well. Of course, the Chinese archaeology is a subdiscipline, is configured in academia as a subdiscipline of history, and so it is considered by many of its specialists as sort of a purveyor of data that will help in the understanding of texts. Now, I do not see myself, my principal function as doing that. That's where I differ, with all due respect, from some of my colleagues in China. But that doesn't mean that I consider the texts unimportant. It would be foolish to ignore them. But one shouldn't allow the texts to prejudge what one sees. And that is very difficult to do, of course, because once you've read them and once you are aware of them, it is so, and especially when the secondary literature is full of sort of arguments that relate to them, it's very difficult to sort of take a position at some distance from this and say, wait a minute, could there be an alternative? Could there have been maybe ideological reasons why people in a particular that time, for instance, refer to Qin as barbarians, not because they really were, alien in their origin, but because there was a discourse in part of the Warring States literature that whenever you disagree with somebody, you call him a barbarian, and that makes them completely unacceptable. Still going on, in fact, sometimes. You have to look at this as our Japanese colleagues say, keisu by keisu. And if you do, maybe after a while things fall into a pattern, or not. Thank you.
Let me remind you that there is a little reception outside to which everybody is invited, and let's thank Professor von Falkenhausen again for a very rich talk.
Thank you.